Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and as the consequences, both direct and indirect, of Trump's international policies continue to cause chaos throughout the world, I like to consider which might ultimately be the most damaging factor for UK trade: Brexit or Trump. Which is worse? Difficult to answer the question scientifically, but we can certainly try to identify some of the key factors. But first, for daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel to stay notified. So if you consider the state of the UK economy today, there are multiple problems dragging us down, but two seem both ridiculous and impactful in equal measure: the presidential policies of Donald Trump and the extreme Tory Brexit. But which is worse? Well, the objective problems with Brexit are fairly well established. They've been studied. Let's begin there. So the OBR, independent group of economists who pronounce judgment on government budgets, continues to maintain that their original calculation that the hard Brexit is reducing our GDP in the medium and long term by 4% still holds. Now, given that economists are constantly having to readjust forecasts, it's remarkable that this one has held firm for so long. Other economists are also in broad agreement, with some thinking that the short-term hit is actually a little higher, maybe up to like 5% of GDP, which may settle down to 4% over the long term. Now, these figures have been used to estimate that if taxes remained as they are, the Treasury would have had an additional £40 billion a year coming in had we remained in the EU, or at least in the single market and customs union. The reason for this is that trade is now much harder with our largest export and import market, but not appreciably better with anyone else. In fact, since COVID, the world has turned increasingly to nearshoring as global supply chains were exposed as quite vulnerable to shocks. And so the idea of building up more trade outside Europe became even less likely than it was before Brexit. But in terms of European trade, what are the specific problems? Well, exports first. So obviously trade barriers being raised with the EU meant it was more difficult for British business to export to Europe. Some products were just simply banned. Others are subject to tariffs and quotas, despite what the government of the time said. All of them require paperwork, which has a cost attached to both the production and the checking. This makes those exports more expensive, meaning less competitive in the European market. In fact, sometimes the paperwork's worth more than the product, in which case you can't sell it. The lower value of the pound since the Brexit referendum against the euro, you could say, well, that helps a little because that always helps exports. But then you get stung on the materials. See, a lot of British goods will need materials or components that are imported from elsewhere, potentially Europe, and these have become more expensive as a result of not just a weaker pound, but raised trade barriers in the opposite direction. In fact, for some EU suppliers, particularly smaller specialist suppliers, the cost and hassle of exporting to Britain became so great they just stopped trying. This left some small British businesses without supplies and they had to close down. Even businesses which don't need to either import from or export to the EU suffered. The cost of electricity increased so much that some businesses had to close due to the price of energy. We're familiar with domestic energy prices doubling, but business rates increased several times, like at least 4 times higher. And you think, well, wasn't this down to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine? So yeah, that was a major factor, absolutely. But the increase was much greater in Britain than Europe more generally. We were hit twice. Once by the reordering of the global gas market in order to apply sanctions on Russia, but again by leaving the EU energy market. Now, I'll discuss this more in my Brexit referendum anniversary video next week, but the point is that electricity prices increased more than they should have because we left the EU energy market, which allows for very efficient matching of supply and demand. We also lost our purchasing power for gas, meaning that even electricity produced in Britain costs more than it otherwise would have because the cost is based on the price of gas. Then there's the problem for consumers. So we import about half our food, the vast majority from the EU. We also import plenty of other products from Europe as well. The cost of these all increased as a result of extra costs for transport, documentation, checking, and scarcity because we have shortages now. And not everyone was willing to pay the higher prices or put up with delivery delays, particularly in the other direction. In Britain, we had no choice. If a company in Britain doesn't like the delays, then if they can't find a supplier in Britain, they're stuck. But in the EU, customers have got an entire continent to turn to. So businesses who had over half of their orders with EU customers found that overnight they were losing those orders because those EU-based businesses just turned to other EU-based businesses in order to make sure deliveries would be reliable. They didn't want them getting held up. So it wasn't just that things became more expensive. Some business was lost entirely, resulting in lower profits and in some cases, well-run businesses suddenly becoming unviable and closing down through no fault of their own. Then, because Brexit sent immigration sky high in a major shock to Brexit supporters who couldn't work it out at all, we've had to artificially restrict it below sensible levels. For example, we're now making it harder to attract foreign students. Who the hell cares about foreign students? But they contribute a lot to the UK economy. University education is actually a form of trade. It's a big export, and its harsh immigration policies are reducing it. We've only just begun reversing some of the unnecessarily draconian trade barriers. There's others we intend to leave up. And even then, even though it'll improve trade, it will not compensate for being outside the single market. So the way in which Brexit hurts our trade is well established, and we can even put a figure on it. The impact of Trump is more complex, partly because it's still ongoing. During his first term, Trump initiated a trade war with the EU. That resulted in tariffs and counter-tariffs which hit some areas of British trade really quite badly, as we were still in the EU at the time. Scottish whisky suffered, steel suffered, the automotive industry suffered, because although Trump was trying to target essentially German cars, British factories were producing some of the parts for them. But his first term was small fry compared to now. He's decided to launch a trade war against the entire world now. Even the penguins were not spared. The consequences end up being a bit too hot for Trump to handle, so there's been a lot of climbing down the taco tree. But the orange one hasn't given up on his tariffs idea altogether. The UK has managed to cut a deal to keep the tariffs in check in return for reductions on tariffs for some American imports. It's not resulted in lowering standards, nor will it in any area where we're working closer on with trade with the EU, such as on food products. But the tariffs still make British products less competitive in the USA compared to, say, last year. A major market for Britain. And the wider global tariffs hit our exports elsewhere as well, because it's not just about our trade with America. If other countries struggle with the tariffs, because the tariffs are everywhere, then that means they're making less money as a country, which means that their people will have less money to buy our products. This is why the UK economy unexpectedly shrank by 0.3% in April. That was put down to the impact of Trump's tariffs. Even the lower 10% tariffs around the world, if they became the norm, will hurt UK trade. And not just to America. Anything which depresses the global economy depresses trade in general, because there's just less money floating around. People do not have as much money to buy imports. Another Trump policy being reported on currently is the so-called revenge tax, part of Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, which levies a special tax on any companies operating in America who are deemed to be owned in other countries, which apply taxes to American products, which is most of them. This may well have the result of lowering investment in America, which in turn depresses America's economy, and then, of course, means the US won't buy as much of our stuff because they don't have as much money. But it also means lower profits for some British investors who may pull out altogether. You know, if they're investing in the US, it means it's profitable to do so. So this is a form of trade, which this tax is working in much the same way as a protective tariff. So it makes trade less competitive. Trump is also carrying out domestic policies which are likely to have the impact of depressing the US economy further, attacking scientists, academics in general, but also launching a literal attack on California, America's biggest economic engine. That, combined with the cuts to federal services, which will save no money, but will remove vital infrastructure, will have the effect of making Americans poorer and, as a result, guess what? Less able to buy British products. When money is tight, non-essential imports are going to be the first to go, and a lot of what we sell to America is not exactly essential. Then there's the geopolitical chaos coming from Trump deciding that we should move from a world where America is dominant, a unipolar world, to one where it shares dominance with others, the multipolar world. Trump is going to make America great again by sharing dominance, world dominance with China, because that makes sense. So what do we have? Well, abandoning Ukraine means European nations, including the UK, have to spend more on defence. fair enough if that's what the USA wants. But it nonetheless was a policy which would not be happening right now if Trump had not won. And because that diverts money away from spending on infrastructure, which could boost trade, that also suppresses our trade potential. It may work out well in the long term, but right now it's a problem for trade. Encouraging Russia rather than applying sanctions increases the chance of a wider conflict across Eastern Europe, as well as Russia continuing to pursue acts of sabotage in Western European countries because we're not doing enough to defend ourselves. We know how much the full-scale invasion of Ukraine damaged British trade, so the potential for the conflict to not only continue longer than might otherwise have been the case, but expand is another threat to trade. In the Middle East, America before Trump was hardly enforcing peace, but the current escalation wouldn't have been possible without Trump's fecklessness. Although none of the areas of conflict represent major trading partners with the UK, the conflict itself could threaten vital shipping routes. Then there's America's cut to foreign development funding. This provided the stability needed to maintain global trade. The problem with foreign development is it's too often seen as charity, but it's not actually charitable. Yes, it means helping people out. It can look like it. It's not. It's an investment in their customers. You know, large trading nations like America want a stable world in order to have stable customers. Removing this funding on the scale the USA have done will actively reduce global trade further, which will also affect British trade around the world as well. The unreliability of the USA as both a military and trading partner has also ironically made it harder to deal with China's own dodgy trading practices, something Trump claims he wants to tackle but went around it in completely the wrong way. But we're having to sort of move a little closer to China at the moment because they are at least stable. But it's very difficult to get serious estimates for the value of all this damage that Trump is causing to trade, because a lot of it's very speculative right now. It's not the subject of major studies. It may be in the future, unlike Brexit. And much of it may still be to come over the next few years. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And for more content, you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.